Saturday, June the 12th, 1982, Baha'alotcha. Please turn in the Chumashim to page 987. Please turn in the Chumashim to page 987. Does anybody recognize the prophetic reading on page 987, which according to the top is the Haftarah, which is recited on Shabbat Chanukah? Anybody recognize it? Jack Snyder, if you answer, I'm going to send you into the corner. I mean, if you didn't answer, we'd send you into the corner anyway. I'm talking about the rank and file, not the sages. Saray? Yes, I should really have asked Shoshana, but I didn't think it was fair to put her on the spot. It's exactly identical, and in fact I think you all should turn to page 620. Let's take a lesson from this, that in fact the Haftarah which Shoshana read so beautifully this morning is in fact duplicated. It's one of those rare prophetic readings which occurs twice during the synagogue calendar. It's from the prophet Zechariah, and it is read in connection with the Sidra this morning, Beha'alotcha. And what do you think the reason might be for having this particular Haftarah read in connection with the Sidra? All congregants except Jack Snyder. I'll only call on Jack if I really have a hard one. Moon? I'm assuming that while this service is going on, you are all diligently concentrating on the meaning of the words and reflecting on the concepts and ideas. Am I right? Yes, okay. So then why would you think that the Sidra of... Take your time, you can look at the Sidra. It begins on page 605. Why do you think this particular reading from Zechariah was chosen today? And the second question, those of you who know the answer can already begin thinking about, is why was the Haftarah duplicated in connection with Shabbat Chanukah? Okay, we have two questions here. Number one, why did our sages of old decide that in conjunction with the Sidra of Baha'alotcha, which commences on page 605, we should read the second chapter of Zechariah, page 620, and why they also decided that on Shabbat Chanukah, the identical reading should be read? Do I have any offers? I'm sorry, I can't hear. The resurrection of the temple. Oh, we have a visitor who's talking. Very good. Well, the temple wasn't exactly resurrected, but you're close to it. You mean rededicated, I think, right. Well, that's the second one. Now you've answered the second question first. The first question is, what is the relationship between the Sidra and the Haftarah this week? Leah? Just a moment, wait a bit. We've got some, family hold back. Yes. Sir. Gentlemen, yes. The creation of the menorah. In other words, if you will look at page 605, you will see that the commandment is given by God to Moses, who is ordered to speak to Aaron about the lighting of the lamps on the candlestick. Actually, this is not the place where the candlestick itself is the orders or the instructions concerning the candelabra itself is given, but the law relating to it. So Aaron did this, he lighted the lamps, and then there's a description of the work of the candlestick, beaten work of gold, according unto the pattern which the Lord had shown Moses. So he made the candlestick. This is taken quite literally by the rabbis of old, who claimed that on Mount Sinai there were certain ritual artifacts, certain objects that were required for the ongoing ritual service of the Jewish people, and to make quite sure that Moses knew exactly how to make them, God showed him replicas of these. That is to say, God showed him a menorah of fire so that he would know exactly how it should be built. And as I'm sure you all know, the menorah has been a symbol of Judaism for well over 2,000 years. In ancient Israel, we see the menorah, but it is a slightly different one. Not quite the menorah that we have on Hanukkah. Does anybody know the answer to that one? What is the difference between the menorah that we are talking about here and the menorah which is used on Hanukkah? Just a moment. Chap nicht. I'll take a show of hands, please. Let's have some order and system. Anybody here? I hear some mutterings in the front here. Well, you've said something already. Can I have a new version? Well, Mark, you can go with Jack Snyder and sit in the corner. I expect you to know these answers. I always like the ones who don't know the answers to answer them. It feels better somehow. Diana, yes. Yes, the menorah has 7 branches, and the Chanukiah, or the candelabrum, which is used for Hanukkah, has 8 branches. Why? Oh no. What's the answer to that one? You got your maths mixed up. Yes, Beverly? No, just a moment. Let's get this mathematical problem solved. Recha says that there is a shamash. That is to say, the shamash is the name given to a functionary in the synagogue, right? The beadle, or the sexton. And the light which lights all the Hanukkah candles is called the shamash. But that's not how we get 8. You're calculating 7 plus 1. That's not what we get. The total number of candles that are burning on Hanukkah on the 8th night are how many? 9. So the problem is, the question I'm asking is, why is the menorah for Hanukkah 8, and why is the menorah of which the Bible speaks 7? And by the way, let's be very clear about this. The state of Israel, in its insignia, has the traditional 7-branched menorah. And the old icons, or the imprints of the menorah in Jewish tradition, especially on graves and in catacombs, was the 7-branched. It was a very simple 1, 2, 3, and a line down. No fancy work at all, just 1, 2, 3, and a line down. As a matter of fact, I don't know whether any of you are aware, I don't know the actual name of the plant, but there is a bush in Israel. There is a bush that resembles exactly this 7-branch, and some scholars maintain, especially in recent years, when there has been a tremendous growth of interest in trying to understand scientifically the correct botanical, zoological, fauna, flora details of everything mentioned in the Bible. And there are museums, and there are zoological enclaves in Israel. And what's the name of that organization which particularly specializes in the flowers? Thank you very much. That one you could answer, because I didn't know that one. I'd forgotten it. Na'ot Kedumim, wonderful organization. I met the organizer who specialized in recreating or trying to understand what exactly the Bible meant by all its references to flowers, to animals, and to birds and bees and whatever. So we have this bush, this plant, and it would figure that the land itself would have produced perhaps the origin of this symbol. The question, however, is, what is the 8th branch? Why do we have 8 for Hanukkah? Yes, Fegel. Well, that doesn't really answer the question, because you could ask why but yes, because you see the story, well, why are there 8 days of Hanukkah? The oil. Yes, the little bottle of oil which was supposed to last only for... You still believe that story? People still believe that story? I thought you grow out of that, like Santa Claus. No, yes, Diana. To tell you the truth, I asked the question, but I don't know the answer myself. I just wanted to see how you would deal with it. But however, I do have a theory. I would never ask a question without a theory. The theory is that the Jews were very particular not to blend the temple with what was non-temple. The temple was the focus of what was sacred. And if a symbol were to be taken out of the temple and used outside, it probably will be modified slightly. And I suspect that that is the original reason why the cruse of oil burnt for 8 days after all said and done. I assume here in this sophisticated audience we know that that is a myth and not an actual factual reality, that a bottle of oil which lasts for 1 day only lasts for 1 day, except in fairy stories. Yes.
Just as a point of interest, I was at some kind of an archaeological dig where there was a symbol of a candlestick where the branches were arranged with the angle, about a 45-degree angle, and it was pointed out by the guide that this was not the Jewish menorah, because the Jewish menorah is formed by the semicircle rather than an angle.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's very interesting. So what I'm suggesting is that the 8 was made because there was a strong tradition in Jewish history not to do outside of the temple or to imitate outside of the temple what could only be done in the temple. Sacrifices could not be offered outside of the temple. And when the temple was destroyed, the second temple was finally destroyed in the year 70 of the Common Era, a lot of wrangling took place among the rabbis as to whether any of the traditions that originally were uniquely associated with the temple could be performed outside of the temple. For example, in the temple, the shofar was blown on Shabbat. But the shofar is never blown on Shabbat outside of the temple. The lulav was used in the temple on Shabbat, but was never used outside. Some of the changes did take place, but there was this stress, whether it was temple or not temple. At least that is one of the origins of this custom. And so the menorah is mentioned in the Sidra, and that would explain Bahalotcha, and the Chanukiah is used for Chanukah, and that would explain the reading of Zechariah for Chanukah. But that's not enough. That's not enough, at least for the story of Chanukah. Why? What is an additional reason for the reading of this Zechariah? You have to look at the actual text. Rabbi Zuckerman, I expect you to know the answer. Mark, you can have a go. What is the question? The question is, first of all I said, why do we have this reading from Zechariah today? And the answer to that is because in the Torah for today, we read of how the menorah in the sanctuary in the wilderness was lit, and therefore we have a reading which speaks of another menorah. And then I said, but why do we read it also on Chanukah, second time round? And the answer was because we have a Chanukiah, we have a candelabrum used for Chanukah. But having said that those answers are right, they're not all the answers. There are other answers that can be given. There's a much more relevant, much more fundamental answer, which unfortunately, particularly today, gives us a problem. In fact, I would say it gives us a headache. It certainly gives me a headache, but we cannot avoid grasping the issue, so we're going to have to deal with it. Yes? That is the answer, and that's a problem which I think tears many of us apart at this particular point, especially after the Israelis had such an enormously militarily successful week. This Haftarah is read twice for any reason one would expect something to be read twice, because it happens to be one of the foundations of classical Judaism. I am stressing classical Judaism. I don't know what the Jewish position is today on this anymore. I will just give you one brief reading from the commentator, Dr. J.H. Hertz of blessed memory, and I will leave it to your own imaginations to see the radical discrepancy, the theological, ideological, philosophical challenge that we face today after an event which can be compared to the Six-Day War in its brilliance and its ingenuity and its clear visible evidence of having been well prepared before the occasion which led to its breakout was already there. The reading is found on page 605, and I'd like you to follow it, and maybe you would like to react to it. I would accept reactions to it. The bottom of page 605 on the left-hand side, the right-hand side, the menorah is one of the favorite symbols of Judaism. Page 605. Through its association with Chanukah, the menorah has come to typify spiritual conquest and that spiritual conquest is achieved neither by might nor by power, but by God's Spirit. See the Haftarah, which is the same as for the Sabbath of Hanukkah. Israel, as the servant of the Lord, is to perform his divine task without violence. He is not to strive nor cry. A bruised reed shall he not break, and the dimly burning wick shall he not quench. The image employed by Isaiah to describe Israel's mission is the gentle agency of light with its irresistible illumination of the surrounding darkness. This is among the loftiest conceptions of all human thought. How new an idea it was is measured by the length of time it has taken before the idea began slowly to make its way that force cannot conquer spirit. Could I have some reactions to that very beautiful commentary? Jake?
I don't accept this classical version anymore. I think the relevance is the story told of Rome in Europe, in which the Rabbi gathered his people together in the summer and said, Kinder, verlost hat sich das Nisi, wann kommt zu solchen Fühlen? The mere fact that there is a need to be violent does mean that ipso facto there is no concern with matters of the spirit. I think it's time to review this question of Bobachor and Bobachai.
Okay, let's look at the verse first, though, to make sure we know what it is.
The reconstruction of the city.
Let's look at page 989. Well, we'll do the Hanukkah one right now. 989, verse 6. I'm going to read it in Hebrew because it's one of the most central verses. And when I say classical Judaism, Jake, let's understand each other. I can't change classical Judaism any more than you can. We can modify it for us, but we can't have a revisionist view of classical Judaism which reads into classical Judaism what is not there. There was a definite reason why the Haftarah from Zechariah was repeated twice. And that is because at the heart of classical rabbinic Judaism was a pacifism, and a passivism as strong as any that informed a Martin Luther King or a Gandhi. And I would be derelicting my rabbinical duty if I pretended that now, because it suits our Jewish purpose to have a strong army, probably one of the most efficient armies in the world, and I hate saying this, but if the Israelis had been in the Falklands, that war would have been over 3 weeks ago. It's a sad comment that in that area we excel universally in the 20th century. In fact, the irony is that the Jews do so well in fighting today that I have a curious kind of feeling that, you see, in the past, the Jews ascribed all the military glory to God. This was what Mark was pointing out before. Look at Hanukkah, for example, the story of Hanukkah. Hanukkah, whatever you can say, is an event that took place in Jewish history about the second pre-Christian century, where a handful of Jews decided they were not going to kowtow to the Syrian Greeks. They fought back, they were successful, they instituted Hanukkah, and yet they are hardly mentioned in the Jewish liturgy. If you look in the prayer book, if you look through the length and breadth of rabbinic literature, you will find no reference to the Hasmoneans or to the Maccabees, one or two oblique references. For Purim, we have a special Masechet, a special tractate in the Talmud which deals with Purim, which is certainly not a more important festival than Hanukkah, perhaps even less, because Purim only affected one Jewish community, whereas Hanukkah affected the very survival of the Jewish people. There is no reference to Hanukkah. There is no Masechet Hanukkah. And the two books of the Maccabees, the second one of which certainly is a literary masterpiece, which deserve to be included in our Jewish Bible, were not included in the biblical canon. Even though a book which dates almost from their time and possibly a little later, the book of Daniel, was included in the Bible. If you want to read the books of the Apocryphas, you will not, the books of the Maccabees, you will not find them in our Bible. You will find them in the Catholic Bible. They are part of the Apocrypha. They were books that were excluded. Why were the books describing the Maccabean exploits excluded from the Bible? Why is there no mention of Judas Maccabeus in the traditional prayer book? Why, when we celebrate Hanukkah, do we tell this story about a bottle of oil which should have only lasted for 1 day, which lasted 8 days? Why does the central prayer which commemorates Hanukkah say of God, you did it all, God. You delivered the strong into the hands of the weak. You delivered the infidels into the hands of the believers. You delivered the unclean into the hands of the clean. You were the one responsible for all this. When we know that in fact it was Judas Maccabeus and his gallant brothers and their colleagues who fought and risked their lives. Does anybody know the answer?
What year was the Bible compiled?
The canon of the Bible was not finally concluded until the middle of the second post-Christian century.
Perhaps that was the reason. We were there under Christian domination throughout Europe.
No. The decision to exclude the books of the Maccabees from the canon took place much before. You see, I answered your question, but it's confusing. The canon of the Bible wasn't finally settled until the middle of the second post-Christian century. In fact, there were certain books that were still struggling to be included, such as, for example, the Song of Songs, the book of Ezekiel, the book of Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes, for reasons I won't go into now. It was still up for grabs as late as the time of Akiba, to whom is attributed the inclusion of the Song of Songs in the Bible on the basis that it was one of the holiest books in the Bible. In fact, it's a love poem, but Akiba was a romantic. So he had a great deal of power, so he managed to get the book included. No, there was no question I would say by the time of Jesus, by the time probably of the first half of the first pre-Christian century, there was no question the books of Maccabees would not be included in the canon of the Bible, because before the actual canonization took place, the Jews knew more or less what the nuclear Bible was going to be. Why were the books of Maccabees excluded? Why is all the glory given to God and not to the Jewish fighters? Back row.
It's because there was a stark comparison with the failure of the revolt against Rome. Maccabean revolt was probably the model, but the Bar Kokhba revolt failed, and therefore...
That's a brilliant and fascinating answer, even though it's wrong. I never would have thought of that before. But the only reason why you're wrong is historical fact, which we can't ignore. The exclusion took place long before the Bar Kokhba War.
God of the Almighty,
Yes.
the concept of God taking control is more important than man taking control. In the beginning of Judaism, it was more important for God to be in control and man to follow God.
Very good. I'll accept that answer. As a matter of fact, you sparked my mind to draw attention to this congregation, many of whom are not Reconstructionists, that one of the things that Rabbi Kaplan did, whether or not we agree with him, it's important to know that he did it, the man who celebrated yesterday his 101st birthday, was to draw our attention to the fact that the traditional Haggadah of Pesach only mentions Moses once, and then only in a biblical quotation. That Moses, who on any reckoning led the Israelites out of Egypt, is only mentioned once and then indirectly in a verse in terms of a biblical quotation. But that the delivery from Egypt is exclusively ascribed to God. Why? Kaplan said this is wrong. In tune with the humanism of our age, we must bring Moses back into the focal point of the Passover celebration. And therefore the new Haggadah, as it was called, reintroduced Moses as a central character in the Haggadah to indicate that it is not possible anymore in the 20th century to say, Lo lanu Adonai, lo lanu ki l'shimcha ten kavod, not unto us, O Lord, not unto us, but unto thy name we give glory. Man has to become important again. Okay? Jake, just a moment. This gentleman over here. Yes, sir. Please. I haven't said anything yet. Oh, that's not a rabbi. That's just a friend. That's Jack Snyder. I just want to be quite sure. Not everybody at the SAJ is a rabbi. We've got plenty of rabbis. I'm sorry, it's okay. It's Jack Snyder. I just wondered what you were talking about. Okay.
That we have learned to go back a little bit in our spiral rise to idealism and spirituality, and depend again upon where it is needed a given amount of pragmatic physical force. However, and the lesson I believe that this is an answer to your question, the lesson to be learned is that if you depend upon force alone and do not encompass in your concepts spirituality as well, your cause, your victory will be vain.
I think you're okay.
Victory will in the end disappear. But if you can combine the necessary force that God imposed upon people to use the force themselves, if you, however, never lose sight of the philosophy of peace, love,
Okay.
and with your force, then perhaps your victories will remain.
Good. I'm going to stop you right now. I'll come back to Jack in a moment, but I don't want to lose this thought because I lost it a few moments ago. You see, sometimes in order to run a human society, it is necessary to prevent the masses of people behaving in a certain way, but authorizing one or a small number of individuals who are, for a variety of reasons, are permitted to act in a way which the average man and woman in the street is not permitted to act in. The idea of, for example, Caesar's wife is above suspicion, or we say that somebody is above the law, or the notion, for example, in the ancient world that somehow the king was above the law. He made the law but didn't have to obey the law, and that all those rules and regulations relating to theft and sexuality, which the ordinary man and woman in the street had to obey, the king was above those laws. Now there's a curious isomorphism insofar as the Jewish people, who from its inception and in its classical rabbinic Jewish form became the people of peace, the people who was described as Rachmanim, B'nai Rachmanim, the merciful ones, children of the merciful ones, developed a conception of God who was the most narcissistic, grandiose, violent creature that ever walked the face of the earth. If you can open the Bible and without any religious preconceptions, and it's very difficult because all of us have our religious preconceptions about the Bible, it's that kind of a book. Simply go through the book and say to yourself, I have a question. What kind of a personality is God in this book? What kind of a personality is Yahweh? Write a psychological description of Yahweh. What kind of psychological problems does he have? Does he need treatment? My dear friends, I hate saying this, but in terms of all the psychological knowledge that I have available, I would recommend that God go and get himself a good shrink. I am talking of the biblical God. Now let's not get excited about this. I am talking about the God in the 5 books of Moses and in the prophets and the writings. He perpetrates genocide because people don't kneel hard enough and quick enough when he's around. He wipes out children because they don't prepare the fire for the altar correctly. He destroys the entire world because they don't obey his law. And when he does that, he doesn't do it because of principle. He does it because he's worried about what it will look like in the New York Times the next day if he lets people off the hook. Not because I love you, he says to the Jewish people, am I going to lead you to your promised land. I couldn't care less about you. You are great, he says to the Jewish people, only insofar as I chose you. And the reason I don't wipe you out completely is because people will say, some God, he brought them out of Egypt and he couldn't get his act together. Now I want to say, by analogy, and listen to this very carefully, and I'm not going to make it a hard and fast analogy, that what I think has happened among some Jews in the 20th century is that we Jews on some level have become our God. that there is an arrogance and grandiosity in the Jewish people, and a sense of we are better than anybody else, of such an incredible order, matched with a brilliance of technique and application, so that instead of speaking of Elohei Tzavaot, the God of hosts, we now have a Jewish people of hosts. And this worries me profoundly. Because although in the Bible, in addition to all these grandiose, narcissistic, malevolent, ambivalent, destructive factors which exist in God, there is also much love and much concern and much compassion. I'm not saying that God is only mixed up. Not everybody we recommend to go and talk his or her problems over with is totally no good. As a matter of fact, very often people who have enormous qualities for creativity and wholesomeness and good have areas where it's important to iron out certain things. I'm not saying that the God of the Bible is totally a washout. I am not denying that he created the world, that he created the people on the world and gave us light and food and warmth and love and all the wonderful things that we have. But in addition, there are some very pathological, arrogant, grandiose traits in the Bible, which in some circles have become embodied characterologically and physically in the Jewish people. Now, I didn't have the good fortune to be around because so many things were happening this week. The play and shiva and funerals and heaven knows what else that takes time of a rabbi. I only got one or two glimpses of what was going on in the Middle East this week. One glimpse was of an Israeli soldier giving a mug of water to a blindfolded Palestinian soldier. I do not believe in any way that the ideological point that I'm making now, that somehow on some level the Jewish people has become their God, applies to all Israelis or all Jews. I'm not even going to evaluate the relative proportion. 10 to 1, 10 to 1, 8, 9 to 1, 8 to 2, 7 to 3. It's idle. Our job is to enhance the spiritual qualities of Jewish life without enhancing spirituality to the extent that Jews are going to be damaged and killed by their enemies who are ruthless, and to try to modify the grandiosity and arrogance where it appears. I believe that act was multiplied a millionfold in the fighting that took place this week. By and large, I do not believe that the Jews as a whole are malevolent or malicious people. And I think the principle of what was called in the Six-Day War, Tar HaNeshek, using arms only to the extent they have to be used, still prevailed. But I think the exceptions grow, and it's that to which I address myself. And the other image I got on a fleeting view of television was a Jewish boy who could have come right out of Yeshiva University in uniform with big horn-rimmed glasses, peering like an owl with his machine gun to see whether there were any Palestinian snipers in a building. And I remembered a statement in a book by Bruno Bettelheim. What is the title of that book? He wrote it after he came out of the concentration camp and got to America. I'm sorry? The Informed Heart, it may have been that. It was one of his first books. It's not important. In a footnote, he describes how when Jews or intellectuals wearing horn-rimmed glasses came to Buchenwald, the Nazis singled them out for special attention, and that the word was passed round to Jews who wore horn-rimmed glasses to take them off, because the Nazis hated people who wore horn-rimmed glasses. They represented an aesthetic approach towards life, a peaceful approach towards life, an intellectual approach towards life, an approach toward life which placed reason above other unrational, irrational, non-rational factors. And to wear horn-rimmed glasses in the concentration camp was to invite yourself to be stomped into the ground. I rejoiced at the sight of a horn-rimmed Jew who looked like an owl from Yeshiva University, capably tackling getting rid of Palestinian guerrillas from this house. And yet, we are in great danger, Because if we produce that idea of God once, in an era of humanism, we are in danger of becoming metamorphosed into that God, because that God came from our heads. There is no God up there. The God of a people is its own mythological creation, which it then worships. That is the way in which society operates, always has operated and always will operate. If you want to believe in your God as something external who exists by himself, be my guest. Here we try to understand where the God comes from. That is our God. And that God of classical biblical religion and classical rabbinic Judaism was a God who was everything that we could not be in our impotence. He was a God on whom we gave all the violence that we couldn't do ourselves. We were too weak to be violent. We were guests in other people's homes. We were always outnumbered, as indeed we are today, even in Israel. And therefore, all those violent characteristics which we would love to have had ourselves, the kind of ability to take somebody we don't like by the neck and punch his nose in, we didn't have. We gave all those attributes to the God of Israel. And that is why the God of the Bible is such a horrendous God. The rabbis tried to do what word should I use? The rabbis tried to do what? Well, you could use that word. The rabbis tried to do laundry on me. I want you to know, if you've studied this, I'll tell you because I've spent the best part of my life on this, that if you compare the God of the Bible, I'm talking of the entire Bible, not just the 5 books of Moses, the Jewish Bible, of course, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. If you compare the God of the Bible to the God of the rabbis, I'd rather spend my time on a shipwrecked island with the God of the rabbis any day of the week.
Thinking about one of the other haftarahs which is repeated, it's done twice, is the one that's done on the 7th day of Passover. It's a song of David that comes from the book of Samuel, in which David is absolutely reverent in the military triumph, full of such passive statements as, then did I beat them small as the dust of the earth, I did stamp them as the mire of the street and tread them down, etc. So the same rabbi who repeated the one haftarah because of the passages seems to have some other...
Ambivalence, yes. Sheila has made an excellent point. I don't know offhand how many haftarot are repeated. I suspect that there are some more, but she's drawn my attention to the fact that there is another haftarah which seems to speak of the opposite conclusion. And those of you who have been coming to the SAJ for any length of time know that this problem of paradox is widespread. But I think, Sheila, even making allowance for your point, the dominant rabbinic God is the God I'd rather spend time with. If I had to go out for lunch with somebody today, I would choose the rabbinic God, not the biblical God. I mean, you can get through to the rabbinic God. The rabbinic God is the God who, when he saw the Egyptians drowning in the Red Sea and heard the Israelites singing songs, rebuked them and said to them, this is the rabbinic God, Ma'aseh yadai tovim bayam, va'atem omrim shira, the works of my hand are drowning in the Red Sea. Will you sing songs? Is it possible, even with all our resentment of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, that we can share with the Israeli mothers and the Palestinian mothers their sorrow, their bereavement this week, and that some kind of a rabbinic view somewhere in the world might look down and be saddened at the carnage that took place, not because of the majority of the Lebanese Syrians or Christians or whatever, but because of the wickedness of a small number of men who are able to induce large numbers of men to be sucked in to their selfish plans. Nor can we get the state of Israel entirely off the hook. The policies of the Begin government on the West Bank generate hostility and hatred. And it would be immoral of me to stand here and say it is an issue of black and white, angels against demons. We Jews are not blameless. And the arrogance and the grandiosity which talks of Judea and Samaria, which speaks as if we have a right based on the Bible and its God of taking over vast tracts of territory which do not belong to us, is obscene and immoral. and there's no need for me to say this on West 86th Street in New York, because enough Israelis are saying it clearly and in spades this week as well as last week. Vayan, I'm sorry, Jack, you had an objection. I want you to have your objection right now.
There is a bit of there's a side to this. I don't think that the rabbis were concerned or were unhappy about violence per se, the success of which they attributed to God's hand. What happened was that the history of the Jewish people was that whoever had power, and where power was successful, it invariably corrupted. It wasn't Judas Maccabeus who was bad, it was the Hasmonean dynasty that was bad. And it may very well have been that book was excluded because of the unsavory history of the descendants of that.
Jake, you've answered the question, and it's my fault. I got carried away because I wanted to get this point about the God, which just occurred to me about 3 o'clock this morning while I was wondering about how one can tackle this very delicate issue this week. I couldn't get up here on this beam and give a triumphalist sermon about our gallant Israeli soldiers, as you all well know. The fact of the matter is that once the Jews came to power in 200 BC and the years thereafter, once the Jews came to power, they acted as immorally as any other group in the history of the world that ever had power. They forcibly converted Gentiles, forcibly, with the edge of the sword. The entire Idumean nation, the Edomites, were forcibly converted by the sword. And as a Christmas gift in return, they gave us Herod the Great, who probably hastened the destruction of the Jewish people and the destruction of the temple in the year 70. We allied ourselves with other states regardless of their moral intentions. Alexander Yanai, who was one of the Hasmonean kings, threw a large cocktail party. You can read this in Josephus if you want. I didn't create this story. And had 300 Pharisees crucified in the eyes of the guests to provide passing entertainment. No love, the Pharisees were the rabbis, no love was lost between the spiritual leaders of the people and those who held power. As Lord Acton once said, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I don't want to labor this point. And some of you might still want to join the nuclear freeze march, which is another issue that we should have spoken about this morning. Poor Shana, did she know she was going to pick such a humdinger Shabbat? And it wouldn't be fair to burden you anymore. Let me conclude by saying as unequivocally as I can that Israel must have guaranteed frontiers and boundaries, and though Israelis cannot expect to stand by idly when their men, women, and children are fired on without rhyme or reason. But there's a vast distance between the desire and the need and the concern to do that and the tendency towards overkill that very often happens when one has the power and the ability to use it. There are many situations in life when we simply cannot react to our enemies the way we would like to. Anyone who has ever felt mugged, or been mugged, or anyone who has been attacked or knows someone who is raped or killed or murdered, in New York City, for example, has felt the desire to go into certain areas of this city which will go unnamed and just fire all around with a machine gun. In fact, people have done such things. People have tried to react because somehow, when you don't know who it is that's hitting you, you just want to go and bomb the whole place down. And the wicked and the righteous should be right back together as long as you get the wicked ones. That's not the way I look at life. I don't think that's the way American civilization looks at life at its best. And I hope this will never become the way in which the Israelis look at life. I spoke earlier about UJA Federation, and I repeat my appeal. Whether you agree or disagree with anything that has been said this morning, our absolute moral obligation to be with our brethren, who after all are doing the fighting, is paramount. Those of you who are planning to go to Israel, please continue to go to Israel. I mailed a check this week for a sum of money which I could not afford, and I told them not to deposit it until June the 15th when I get paid, to Naomi Salas at Danico Travel, one of my sons already lives in Jerusalem, and my second son will be spending the summer in Jerusalem. Visit Jerusalem. Be there. Let your children go there. Let there be a kind of intercourse between world Jewry and Israeli Jewry in which we will share our concerns and opinions, but realize that they are the ones that have to live there. But above all, let us support those institutions in our community, such as Judaism Federation, which lead us. I cannot see how any Jew can leave the synagogue this morning without making some kind of a pledge to support as much as he can those philanthropic organizations which help Israel to carry its enormous burden in this world. I don't think there is any room for triumphalism. I do not believe in the traditional God, but I often invoke him for metaphors. I cannot believe that a dead Palestinian is any greater or lesser value in the sight of God than a dead Israeli, and vice versa. And at the mourning of parents, and above all, the loss of innocent men, women, and children, both sides of the border is something that must cause agony to all of us. We mourn all the dead. Would it were the case that the United Nations were a place where these kinds of issues could be discussed intelligently, and personally, the United Nations is a sham, and therefore the Israelis have no alternative but to take the law into their own hands. We are all part of one Jewish people. Let us dedicate ourselves to the advancement and the enhancement of that people. There are times when all of us have to invoke violence. There are times when all of us have to realize that the way we are behaving ourselves generates violence. There is much heart thinking to be done on both sides this week. We rise for Aleinu on page 194. Saturday, June the 26th, 1982, Korach.